Hey, everybody. Welcome back. I'm Susan Lindner, your host of the Innovation Storytellers Show, now officially part of the LinkedIn Podcast Network. I'm really excited today for our conversation with my guest, Paul Orlando, professor of entrepreneurship at USC, but so much more, because we're going to be talking about integrating startups, accelerators, and the coolest new stuff into the innovation process at big companies today. Many of you I know have had the experience of working with startups, some good, bad, and ugly. And some of you have even created your own accelerators and incubators inside of the business. And I want to dive in a little bit more into that conversation today, because I think there's so much that we can learn from my guest. Paul Orlando has built 4 startup accelerators around the world in Hong Kong, LA, Rome, and virtually. He is a professor of entrepreneurship at the University of Southern California and runs the on-campus startup incubator program. He is a former startup co-founder and is proud of a win at the TechCrunch Disrupt Hackathon. That is no small shakes. Wow. His interest is in understanding the why now question, or the way timing impacts product success. And we're going to dive into all of it today. Paul, thank you so much for joining me, Professor Paul.
Oh, I'm so formal. Susan, thank you. Thanks. Really happy to be here.
So let's get into it. How did you get into it? How did you get into entrepreneurship and accelerators and incubators and the wild, wacky world of innovation?
So that is a great question. And it was a pretty natural process for me. I was forced into it, actually.
Okay.
So I had the experience of, I was working in New York City at the time, working at a consulting firm, and I had the experience of watching that firm on a big trend upward, and we're hiring and the business is going well until one day it wasn't. And this is around the previous financial crash, so around 2008. And so I had the experience of suddenly, well, I could kind of see it coming, but being laid off. And what was I going to do next was the big question. Over the previous months, I had actually been discussing some ideas with a handful of friends. And we knew, hey, at one point or another in our lives, we want to do something. We're not exactly sure what in terms of a new business. We were discussing ideas. There was no catalyst for making, at least me, go and try it out. And so I was forced into it. And rather than go and look for, at the time, a non-existent job doing what I used to be doing, I started to explore very seriously, and then actually went ahead and we actually started to build what became the startup that we ran, which was a company called ChatFay back then. So I was forced into it. And I'm happy to tell you a little bit more about that process and then what it led to afterwards. Should I just keep going? I guess I should just keep.
Yeah.
Okay.
Tell us.
So we became very interested in how specifically voice as a communication medium is, or at least back then, was a little abandoned. It was orphaned. People were increasingly going to text or video, looking at screens. And we thought there was still a lot of power behind the human voice as a way to communicate. And the first iteration of what we built was, you can think of it as a mass consumer way of talking to another person who has the same interest as you. So you can talk about a specific political issue, about sports, about something in current events, and we would match people up. We actually put a lot of research into how do you appropriately match people? What information about them do you want to share or not? And then looking at metrics that helped us to understand, was that a good talk? Did they enjoy it? Are they coming back? And the process of building that, and we built the thing from scratch. These days, if you wanted to build what we had done back then, it's a couple days using low code and no code tools. You probably also ask some generative AI for help with the development of the code, and you can be off and running pretty quickly.
For us, it was the copy, right, on the forward-facing side.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
all of that. So that process has become certainly much faster to do, but we We did it the old-fashioned way. And what we discovered was, well, we have something that does intrigue people, and people do enjoy it. And when I would talk about what we were building with other groups of startup entrepreneurs around New York, it would actually typically take over the conversation, because this seemed, just at the time, it seemed so different and it seemed so much like fun. A lot of people tried it out, they signed up. And about a month in, I realized this thing is not going to work out. With all of the positive responses that we received and all of the like, oh, this is so cool, like all of those responses, I realized, in fact, even less than a month, that this was not working out. And for us, it was around a lack of retention. So people would try it out and they wouldn't really keep going back. That forced us to pivot, change our focus. And we ended up turning this into a B2B service. The best use case of this was for a patient population, people going through a serious illness. They are isolated at home. They can't get to an in-person support group. They want to talk to another human being who understands what they're going through. And that's what we ended up shifting to do. And so we worked instead with support group leaders, doctors. We didn't have to worry about how do I sign up all of these individual users, and instead just work with a smaller number of people who had their own user base.
Mhm.
And that also let us kind of focus in a different way. And it solved the retention problem. It solved a lot of the business model questions that we had at the time. And that's, yeah, that was my first, I'll say, foray into something entrepreneurial.
Well, welcome to the world of initial failure, followed by pivot,
Sure.
learning, growth, success, right? This is
Right.
how we do it.
Right.
And it certainly happens at the startup scale, but it also happens at the grown-up scale, at the corporate level. So what
Definitely.
led you to start creating incubators and accelerators? How did that get going?
So it was another natural progression, I'd say. During that time, I started to run very much on the side. I started to run a founders roundtable series in New York. I would get 8 or 10 founders of other early stage companies together. We would meet every 1-2 weeks. When I first started to do it, the first day, I went in the room with, here's my curriculum. We're going to go through modules 1, 2, 3, and here's some reading, and we're going to do this and that, almost like it was a class. And I threw that all out the first 5 seconds, because I realized these startup founders, these CEOs, they wanted to just exchange with each other what's going on with them, what they are having some difficulty with. Has anybody dealt with this? What did you do in this situation? And that's where the value really was for them.
Just
So
experience sharing,
it was
peer-to-peer
that
experience sharing.
exactly.
Yeah.
Hearing from somebody else who dealt with a similar situation, it's not to say that you are then going to copy what they did, but it's going to maybe spark some insight for you. You also know that you're not the only person in the world who has dealt with this problem. You have these other reference points, and in some cases, it also just helps push people to go for something a little bigger, because you do see examples of successes as well as the hard things. I kept doing that with multiple groups for about 6 months. And over that time, I just realized I want to make this a bigger part of what I do.
Mm.
At the
And were you
time,
part of, Paul, were you part of the New York Tech meetup and that whole scene?
I would go to that. Yes,
Uh-huh.
I never spoke at that one. That was
That
maybe
was
at the
the
time,
holy
I think the
grail
biggest one.
back
That
in the
was like
day.
a huge one.
Yeah.
That's like thousands of people. I
Yes.
spoke at many other meetups and other events back then, but I realized that I just enjoyed working with founders. I enjoyed helping connect people. I felt at that point I had also personally a little something to share about my own experience. And I was looking for a way to make that a bigger part of what I did. And I was actually thinking, well, maybe I can eventually go and I could join a startup accelerator. And so I was visiting them, I was mentoring at various ones around New York. And the typical accelerator, it's not a huge team. It's not like they are, hiring lots of people all the time. In general, it's a relatively small organization, or a kind of a tight-knit organization. I was looking for a new market that I could go into. At that point, New York had about 10 of these programs, and I didn't think, well, if I want to truly do this, I shouldn't really try to build the 11th one here. Maybe I should actually go somewhere where there's demand, but it's not being satisfied.
Yeah.
So earlier in my career, I had worked in Asia a lot. I'd done a lot of work in China. I had lived in Hong Kong for a number of years. My network was pretty much gone at that point, but I thought, I wonder if there is a potential market for this outside of New York, outside of the US. And so I started looking around. I cold emailed a number of people in Hong Kong who I found were in the startup community there, investors, some startup founders, and initiated these conversations just by email about my interest. Could Hong Kong be a good candidate for a startup accelerator? There isn't a program there now, just getting feedback. And then I ended up taking a trip over, again, went for a couple of weeks, where I basically met as many people as I could in that 2-week period, and came away believing, okay, I think there's potential. There's some latent demand that's not being served. I can also get people in from other places pretty easily. Hong Kong, at least back then, was an easy place to go for a few months and participate in something like an accelerator. And I kept that discussion going. I actually needed to change the business model because I could not initially raise money for this. So I flipped the model around, and the first version of it was like a tuition, like you would pay for participation in the program. And from doing that first iteration, I was able to demonstrate people were better coming out of this than when they came in. I actually had some people from around Asia Pacific who flew in to participate. And it was enough to then demonstrate, okay, there's something here. And then from doing that, one of the other people I had gotten to know locally, his company ended up backing the small fund that we then used to invest in 12 companies across 2 cohorts for that first accelerator in Hong Kong. So it was basically those steps, looking for that new market and then just figuring out like how to put this together.
And so from Hong Kong, you wind up going back to LA to doing this virtually. Let's shift the conversation a little bit. The success of these startups and moving through, and we've seen accelerators that work and don't work. So give us what do you think are the top 3 or the top 5 things that really make an accelerator successful for the startup itself? What are the components of a great accelerator that you absolutely positively have to have in order for progress to be made?
Great question. There are many of these programs, and not all of them are super valuable. So if you're coming at this from the startup's perspective, why you might choose one accelerator over another, a few factors that you want to consider. So what is the experience like while you are actually actively in that program? So these are they're not very long, typically 3 months, maybe 6-month long programs. So what's that experience like? You can get a bit of feedback by looking at how the program describes itself. They might actually talk about various activities they do. Even better, go and talk to some of the portfolio companies about their experience. So, and everybody's interest is going to be a little specific to them, but it'll give you more of a perspective. Hey, this is our chief concern. What do they have experience in this, or do they run workshops related to that? Or if I'm the only company that shows up with this type of business, this industry focus, this specific
Technology
problem,
focus,
yeah,
right?
does the program actually go out and then appropriately source an expert or 3 who I could then learn from?
Okay, so step 1 is what do we want the environment to be? Step 2 is
Yes.
sourcing the right mentors who
Yes.
will gird the program and guide the startups.
Right.
Okay.
Yes, with the exception of very specific programs, there are programs that are specific to a specific technology or have a very tight industry focus. For example, for those, just within the accelerator team, they might have that expertise satisfied. Otherwise, in general, a program is probably pulling in a multitude of business types, and they can't do everything themselves in-house. They want to, as a result, they want to pull in a range of different mentors. So, you might have your standard mentor list. You might also augment the mentor list depending on who is in the program at that given time.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
yeah,
So when we get past the mentors now, making sure you got the right people on the bus, so to speak,
right.
what else do we need to be successful?
So, a few other things. I also look to that startup founder community.
Mm.
So, does this program help you plug into a larger pool of startup founders who you could then go back to and get advice from them, get help from them? Even in some cases, some of the larger programs today, those are actually sometimes your first customers. If you are building a B2B service, it's a little funny sometimes, but you might actually end up selling to some of the other portfolio companies from previous cohorts. But regardless of that, it's, hey, I am now finished with the program, or I'm 6 months out, I'm a year out. I still want to be able to draw upon that group knowledge
And the
and
network.
that network,
Yeah.
definitely.
What do you think? How critically important is it for an accelerator to promise or to provide direct access to potential customers while in the program?
So I would be careful or thoughtful with that. If you promise that, you really need to deliver on it.
Because oftentimes accelerators say, we'll put you in direct contact with 10 potential customers, or the flip side of that, 10 potential investors.
Right. Right. So, and that's where it's a question of what actually, so there's the promise, but what is actually delivered. So we'll take each of those in turn. So on the investor side, many programs do demo days, or they will bring investors in, or they just have good relationships with investors. The accelerator is a feeder into different VCs, different angels. So when it comes to helping a startup founder get access to potential investors, a program can speed that process up. They can make appropriate introductions. The accelerator management knows or should know where to appropriately introduce people or not. So that is one area where I'd say, many programs can help startup founders, out. Even if they're not making the introductions, helping prepare those founders to know at what point should I really be actively pursuing investment? How should I tell my story? How should I pitch to these potential investors? What metrics should I be looking at? Is the team appropriate for what we're trying to do? How much should I try to raise in this environment? All things like that. The separate question on introduction to customers is sometimes a little trickier because I can't necessarily guarantee that. I mean, I might help get somebody in the door. I can't necessarily guarantee that they are actually going to then buy.
Right.
But
And we don't know that, right? But we
right,
do, I think we do want to feel like, and I've mentored now in 6 different accelerators, most of which are not native English speakers. So they're international companies coming to the United States. Just the ability to get in front of a large corporate and try to sell them, or a potential customer, especially in a new market, is so illuminating, I think, for young companies that are really trying to do it. That we certainly can't promise the revenue, but we can promise, I hope, right? I hope some accelerators do that. But do you think that's a prerequisite for a good accelerator experience?
I wouldn't I wouldn't call it a prerequisite. I would say if you can deliver on that promise, then you have an even stronger program.
Mm,
And many of the corporate accelerators that are out there, that is one of the promises they make. They, at least in my experience, that's sometimes a little tricky. because remember, if this is a short program, it's only a few months long, and I've made this promise, you're going to get access to senior decision makers. We're going to open the doors. We are going to be your first customer. This is a corporate program. What I have seen happen, unfortunately, sometimes is I just can't get on that senior decision maker's schedule. Yes, in theory, I have access to them, but the program is ending in 2 weeks. What's going to happen? And
Right.
so
And those
matching,
companies might not have been ready for the big CEO meeting, right? Big
absolutely
senior
right.
executive meeting, having
Yeah,
reviewed way
absolutely.
too many pitch decks in my life.
Absolutely right.
Yeah.
So that's where we just need to make sure that we're balancing the needs of those startups, or what we were promising them, and what we can actually deliver, say, in that time period. Or maybe we have to say, you're still part of the family. You can come back in 6 months when you are ready, or here is a process that will take you through that, and we're not abandoning you on the end of the last day of the program or the demo day. So yeah, that's something important as well.
Yeah. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about corporates, because part of your consulting work, right, outside of your professorial duties and running the Startup and Accelerator program at USC, is helping large companies begin to think about, how do I actually create an accelerator program internally? A lot of companies want first dibs, first eyes on the coolest new technologies coming out, and some companies have built it. Other companies say, what do we know about startups? And I've certainly have had guests on this show who said, any startup we've brought in here, we've absolutely destroyed, whether
Mhm.
it's through cybersecurity concerns, localization concerns, just the scale that we need to work on. It's impossible. No one's here to champion that idea. So
Okay.
give us a lowdown. Like, what do you think about, first of all, who's a good candidate for starting a corporate accelerator? What are some of the considerations that a head of innovation at a large company should be considering before starting an accelerator or an incubator process?
Well, that's a really interesting question for how they might think about it. And I suppose I actually don't usually see people even ask that question when they think of these programs. But who is a good candidate for doing this? So companies that are open enough to at least tangentially exploring a range of new ideas, and then how they might mutually benefit from those. So whether it is in a customer relationship, whether it's an investor relationship, whether it's in some cases actually talent acquisition. In one program I was involved in, it was, we just want, like, we would have already done a marketing or a PR campaign for a similar budget. We actually get an early look at what some companies are doing with technologies that we are interested in.
Mm,
So it's really, I would say, like, probably a number of the answers I'm going to give you are, it's really specific to the needs of that organization. Like, where are they in their overall development? What's important to them? But I could see, like, there's a range of different answers that they might have there that could all be appropriate.
yeah. So you need step one, take a look at your overall strategy, right? And your innovation strategy, and think about where this could fit in. Is there something like, you're ripe for an accelerator when? Is there something like, well, we've already acquired or invested in 10 startups to date, it's time for us to take this in-house? Or do you think there are like some tipping points, or even like waterfall levels, where we think, okay, now's a good time to start considering this?
I think there could be.
Mm,
So the good thing about having, say, an in-house innovation department, or of some sort, those are also very open what that could mean. But the good thing about having a group like that already in existence, and then also exploring something like an accelerator, where you're bringing external people partway in to your organization. The good thing about that is the external accelerator, it lets you do some things there that would never be palatable in-house in the organization. So whether it is exploration of certain ideas or business concepts, business models, just a quick and relatively low budget exploration to
mm,
do, in comparison, working on a working on a similar type of concept in-house versus finding a team that's already doing something kind of in the area that you want to explore and then bringing them in some way, whether it's through a small investment or participation in this program. As long as you have access to the entrepreneurs and they also know about you, and so you're not always like in a search, but there's also inbound. As long as you have that set up, running an accelerator program can let the corporate parent just speed up the process of which they're learning. So they might say, this is an industry that we are in, or here's our short list for topics that we want to explore. Doing that in-house would mean it's hiring internally, it is larger budgets, it's maybe operating a little safer because this is coming from us, versus I might be able to find 10 companies that are a relative fit for what you're interested in, and you could be working with them much sooner, less expensively, and get results from a team that is full-time working on that specific concept.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I think that's another way to think about that question.
Yeah, I've certainly heard of folks hiring like a Techstars, for example,
Right.
that have all different kinds of like corporate partnerships now, who go out and say, we'll find you 10 startups a year for the next 3 years. That price tag is exorbitant, in the millions, just to source those young companies. And then the
Right.
corporates themselves are left to determine, okay, do we or don't we want to work with these technologies? Which is a little bit different. It's kind of outsourcing your accelerator experience to some degree, right? Having someone else source it. But I think what I've heard in over 25 years of working with startups is that if there's not a corporate champion inside the company that says, we absolutely positively have to solve this problem, it's costing us X number of dollars, and we don't believe the most effective way to solve that problem is by creating a solution in-house, then the opportunity to create accelerators around a specific set of problems can be the most efficient way to do that when you bring in the right champions and the right startups.
Right. Right. And you make a good point also. Like, I mean, Techstars is a great program. It's a big program, but you're right. It is an expensive one as well. And like, should you go with an outsourced version, or should you generate a little bit of that in-house capability? Or there are also less expensive outsourced versions of that. I mean, personally, I like the model of, when I work with a corporate, helping them understand what's important to them, building an appropriate program. And I really don't go in with, here's my recipe and I just execute the same thing all the time. I like to recreate at least half of what I'm doing every single time, because the situation is just different.
Mm.
And then helping get that first 1 or 2 batches in, running it, and then also training people internally so that it can be then transferred over to the corporate at some point, and keep the knowledge in-house. Also just get a different level of buy-in to continue the program. And you're right, like if you lack a number of those things, or if you just don't have a champion internally, a lot of those steps are going to be pretty tough to take.
Well, and not to mention, right? So, okay, so we get these great companies in, and then what happens after 3 months? Maybe they've sold us the solution. Maybe we force them to custom build something for us that may or may not have any relevance outside of our corporate walls. And then what do we do? Do
Yeah.
we buy them? Do we continue the accelerator? Do we create a new bumper crop to figure out a new set of problems and leave this next one to die on the vine? What happens next after you get three months into your accelerator, 6 months in, and you have a solution? What now?
Portfolio management is a piece of what you're talking about, and that is ironically, it's easier for a standalone accelerator to do that than it is for a corporate. So the
Mm.
standalone accelerator, they have a fund from which they are investing in the companies. And typically these are relatively small investments. There's not a lot of due diligence on these companies because you have maybe a couple intakes a year. You're looking at a lot all at once, and you need to make some decisions. And it's, who is a fit? Are we interested in this topic or that? Do we like the team? Is there potential? And the way that an accelerator program eventually succeeds financially is they have exits from the program. But those exits, they take years typically. And if the accelerator is going to be financially successful, you can't go in with a budget to support you for 1 year. You're really talking about 5 years, certainly, to just give yourself the chance to have some wins from the companies that you've selected. A lot of these companies are not going to make it. On the corporate side, that same patience also needs to be respected. So one of the challenges, and I also see this from civic run programs where there is a budget from a municipal government or a national government being put into these companies every year. In fact, I saw this in one case, like every year, there's a meeting and you have to report results. You're guaranteed to look bad at least the first few years. You just haven't had the time for a win yet. And eventually people start to ask the question, why are we still doing this thing? We haven't seen results. And it's the first, the second, the third year. So having that commitment up front, okay, we are going to fund this for, personally, I would say a minimum 5 years. We're not going to put any strong expectations on something like an exit before that time. We'll look to the other very big, successful, look to Y Combinator. The first few years of their operation, there wasn't a lot of big news to share. And they were also, they're a great program. They were also one that was lucky. Like in that first batch, they had Reddit as one of their companies. So you could say, hey, was that luck, or was that they became successful because they were in the program? Either way, they had one of the big exits right in their first batch, which helped them continue to build. A corporate program needs to have that same patience and just, we're going to commit to doing this, and it's going to be even worse. It's going to be worse for us if we pull the plug after a couple of years because we don't see an early win.
Yeah. And it's almost like you need the patience of a venture capitalist, right? And
That's
part
right.
of it, I think part of the mindset around running an accelerator is as a venture capitalist, right? Because
Right.
your return on investment is, in theory, either using the product or watching this startup take off. And the other part of the scenario then is whether or not corporate innovators want to begin investing in startups. So it's one thing to host a program where we match you up with experts internally to help you evolve, right? And our corporate employees become mentors to these young startups. It's another thing entirely to say we're actively putting in $1 million, $500,000 in seed money to see what you're able to do with it and grow it, hopefully to solve our problem, but maybe the larger market too. And so now, we're looking at balance sheets in a whole different way because we're making investments in companies as opposed to mentoring.
Right.
How do
Right.
you, is there any arbiter, Paul, or is that kind of just based on the stomach and frankly, the expertise? Because a lot of these programs die because corporate innovators are not venture capitalists.
Right. And they're also not compensated in a similar way. So whether you have a big win or a big loss, at least with most of my experience with them, it's not that they are not paid a bonus that was comparable to the big win of an exit in, say, the context of a VC. So one thing I've not been able to do successfully on that question is trying to show, well, is it worth it for your team to then tie some of your compensation to exits? And in other words, do something kind of in the middle of what a VC or an investor might experience. Day to day, I'm taking a lower relative compensation, but when we do have these exits in the future, I'm going to get some piece of that upside that helps people be pretty diligent on the decisions they make. It changes a bit of the incentive structure. But that's often at a conflict to the way the typical corporate is structured. But I mean, you're bringing up all these great points for why it simultaneously makes sense for corporates to want some type of accelerator program, but why it's also difficult for them to actually execute and
Yeah.
commit long term.
So can you tell us a story, like if I'm a corporate innovator and I'm thinking about starting this, how do I actually get it off the ground? Like, what's the story I need to tell in order to get my CEO, the rest of my team on board, business line leaders who are constantly bitching about a problem that they need solved that you think gets solved at the start? What's a story that you've heard some of your clients tell about how to do that?
Some pieces of that story would be you have your baseline where you are today and timelines, budgets, or just results of what you're experiencing in your own in-house innovation efforts, and then comparing it to something that you could work towards or you could experience. And so a few of these models or a few of the, and I would really kind of take this phased approach. You're not going to kick off a super impactful program probably immediately. It's going to be a process. So I would structure this more or less in the following way, where you have an initial period where you are trying to understand what the important questions that you're trying to answer are, whether it's on a kind of a business concept focus, market focus, etc. Then do something lightweight, almost like a pre-accelerator that would enable you to just get in the game. This could be something as light as you have an event, you sponsor a conference, you get people together in some fashion, and they're sharing what they're working on. Maybe you're sharing what you're doing internally and why you are then going further on this path. With some awareness later on, you can also bring external startups in-house in some way. That doesn't even need to be a formal accelerator yet. That could be, we're going to do a hackathon, we're going to do a workshop, we are going to present to you some of our big business questions and see, is there something on your side, you as the founder, your side, where you think there's something that we could work together on. And then after that, actually trying to structure a more formal program. So ideally by that point, you have awareness, you've already built some of these relationships, getting that set of applications. By then, you kind of know where to go, people know about you, and you've also demonstrated that you're serious about this, you are a good partner. If I'm a founder and I could apply to 1,000 different programs, I actually want you on the top of the list for these other experiences I've already had, or what I've read, what I've heard. And then, kind of like we were discussing earlier, you might then appropriately structure like the formal program. But I think there's a lot that a company can do upfront, and those things I just mentioned, not a lot of commitment to that, both in time and budget. Let's just explore an event. Let's explore even something like an office hours, just an exchange where we talk about what we do. So one of the programs I visited was it was actually a co-working space that I visited that had in-house corporate residents.
Hmm.
And they had a company that was a candy company that would visit every once in a while, and they would just get people together for a talk. And it was around, I believe, around Halloween. And so the exec from the candy company said, I want to tell you about a problem that we have. It's packaging. We have these different holidays. You have Halloween, you have Christmas, you have Easter, you have like all these different holidays where the colors of the candy, or like the colors associated with that holiday, they're different. So even if the candy inside is the same, an orange and black package, which says this is for Halloween, I can't sell that in November.
Right.
And so that costs us X dollars every year. And we have this wasted candy or wasted packaging that we've already produced when it's not sold. And in the audience, there just happened to be someone with expertise in materials science who said, oh, actually, I think something that we've been working on could be a fit for this. If you irradiate the packaging in this type of way, or if there's this type of material, you could actually change the colors. And you could take a bag that was slated for Halloween and you could turn it into, you turn the orange and black into green and red. Yeah, I'm kind of extrapolating here.
Yeah, yeah.
So from that mismatch of founders and corporate executives, all of a sudden, this problem, which just seemed to be, well, that's just the way it is. This is something we have to deal with every year, this amount of wastage. It gets in front of someone with appropriate expertise who then also says, oh, I could actually help you with this. And this is how I would step through it. So some of that is a bit of a coincidence, right? So how do you make that coincidence happen more often or in a more meaningful way? You really have to start just building this network, kind of building your list, putting these questions out there, and then getting in front of the right people.
Hmm.
So I think, yeah, I think there's just like a lot that can happen even before an official program is launched.
These are all fascinating suggestions. So anything else that you think our listeners should really be thinking about as they look out into 2023? Startups are facing a very tough funding environment right now, but there are so many amazing technologies out there. Is this the right time to start an accelerator or an incubator inside of a company right now?
It could be. I'm biased, right? It could be, depending on your situation. So there might be some market trends. I mean, we're having this call a week after the Silicon Valley Bank crisis.
Implosion. Yep.
So, right. So we're having this call like in the wake of that. And ironically, it actually might open some opportunities for a corporate accelerator to come in and take some pressure off some of the startups that are now facing a very different funding environment, or just, they're a little more concerned about their long-term viability, as a result. So there could be some opportunities here, and I don't mean that in a predatory way at all. I think it just might speed up some things that would have happened anyway.
Mm.
So yeah, I think that the timing could actually be a fit for exploring this. And likewise, on the startup side, remaining nimble and like, just if you stay focused as a startup founder on what you actually are trying to achieve. So like many founders, they are passionate about a specific problem, about a specific customer segment. They actually want the world to have access to this thing that they are trying to build. Working with a corporate, if that gets you there, and if it gets you there faster than by yourself, I would explore it. It's you don't have to, you certainly don't have to build completely independently, and keeping your exploration a little bigger than the more typical, say, privately run startup accelerators could be an option for you now.
Fantastic. So I'm now going to ask you like the three hot seat questions that I ask all of my guests. So question number one is, what do you think is the greatest innovation of all time?
I'm going to say weaving. So like textiles,
Weaving.
weaving. And I know very little about weaving, but
This shocks me,
just
Paul.
but
Shocking.
but just the idea of how. So I've been reading recently about like early factories in textile production, like England and also Northeast US, but how these techniques were developed and how you went from like hand woven items to mass production, and the study of the strength of different fibers and like how to put them together. To me, like I think like a natural step is, okay, you can wear, talking thousands of years ago, you can wear an animal skin, you can do something out of like an entire piece of something and make that into clothing. But the ability to go through all of those steps, whether it's plant fibers or animal fibers, something else, make them into these threads, and then put the threads together in a way that you have a durable garment. I actually think that's something we should recognize.
Okay. And if you had a chance to join any innovation team in history, what would it be?
I would say it's the mid 1900s Bell Labs.
Oh, yes, that is a favorite one on this show. And
And
lastly, what really pisses you off, or what isn't something exciting or something you just wish existed in the world that currently does not?
oh, that's a tough one. That's really a tough one. I want so I have young kids and my sleep is constantly interrupted.
Mm.
I wish I could just, whenever I can, fall asleep just like that.
So
And
some kind of pill or some kind of like
right, right,
inhaler or something would have
yep,
allowed you to fall asleep
yep,
instantly,
right,
but
with no side effects. Yeah,
right, with no side effects, and to be attentive to your child in the event that they actually needed you.
exactly.
Yeah. Well, Paul Orlando, professor at the University of Southern California and incubator, accelerator, aficionado, thank you so much for joining me on the Innovation Storyteller Show today. How can people get in touch with you?
You can find me on LinkedIn. Just search for Paul Orlando or P Orlando. Also on Twitter, P Orlando. And yeah, if anyone is interested in talking further about these topics of corporate innovation, corporate accelerators, how you might work with a program like this or develop one of your own, happy to talk. And like you said at the top of the show, I'm also very interested in this timing question or this why now question. That's also something I run workshops on, and I am also happy to talk to people about how timing impacts a product success. So
Like
either
good
way,
comedy,
yeah,
timing really matters.
timing
Absolutely.
matters. Yeah, that's it.
Paul, thank you so much for joining me on the show today.
Thanks, Susan. Great to be here.